He slid his hands around another woman's waist in his own home, on his own wedding anniversary, and he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed when his wife walked through the door. Imani Badu had spent 11 years loving a man the entire city feared. 11 years building a life inside walls that were never meant to hold warmth. And in 30 seconds, standing in the doorway of her own kitchen, she watched every one of those years crack down the middle like old glass. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just stood there, and that stillness was somehow worse than any explosion could have been. If you have ever loved someone so completely that their betrayal didn't make you angry, it made you quiet, then you already know exactly what Imani felt in that moment. And if you've ever wondered what it costs a powerful man to finally understand what he destroyed, stay with us. Because this story is just getting started. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. These are the kinds of stories that stay with you long after they're over. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into. The penthouse smelled like gardenias. That was the first thing Imani noticed when she stepped off the private elevator on the 42nd floor, that familiar scent she'd chosen herself 3 years ago, when she'd finally convinced Dae-Hyun to let her replace the harsh chemical smell of whatever industrial cleaner his staff used with something that actually felt like a home. Gardenias. He'd complained about it for a week, called it too soft, too much, said it made the place smell like a hotel lobby for people who'd never stayed in a real hotel. She had laughed at him and bought 3 more diffusers. Now she stood in the elevator foyer, heels in her hand, stalking silent on the marble floor, and she smiled at the memory of that argument, the small, stupid kind of argument that only exists between people who are comfortable enough with each other to argue about nothing. She was early. She knew that. The reservation wasn't until 8, and it was barely 6:30, but she'd left her meeting with the caterer downtown ahead of schedule and thought, why not surprise him? It was their anniversary, 11 years. She'd planned to change into the dress she'd bought specifically for tonight, the one she'd hidden in the back of her closet. For 2 weeks, the deep emerald wrap that Dae-Hyun had once said made her look like someone worth starting a war over. She padded down the long hallway toward the bedroom, and then she heard it, a laugh, low and unhurried. A woman's laugh, the kind that carries a specific kind of ease, the kind that belongs to someone who is comfortable where they are standing. Imani stopped walking. Her brain did what brains do in moments like that. It tried to find the most reasonable explanation. Staff member, a cousin, one of his associates with a female companion. There were always people moving through Dae-Hyun's world, always names she only half remembered, faces that appeared and disappeared like weather. She turned the corner into the main living room. Dae-Hyun was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, with a woman Imani had never seen before, one hand resting against the small of the woman's back, not incidentally, not accidentally, but with the particular familiarity of someone who has touched that space many times before. The woman was leaning into him slightly. His head was bent toward hers. They were talking in that close, quieted way that people only talk when the conversation belongs only to the two of them. Imani didn't make a sound. But something in the room shifted that invisible pressure that changes when a third person enters a space where they were not expected, and Dae-Hyun's head came up. His eyes found hers immediately. Imani watched his face. She had spent 11 years learning the geography of that face, every closed-off expression, every micro-change in his jaw, every way he used stillness as a shield. She knew his face, the way you know, the floor plan of the house you grew up in. You don't have to look. You just know. What she saw in his eyes in that first half-second before he could arrange himself, before he could remember to be controlled, was not surprise. It was calculation. He was already thinking about what to say. That was the moment Imani Badu's heart did not break. It did something quieter and more permanent than breaking. It simply closed. Imani. His voice was steady, infuriatingly steady. He stepped away from the woman, like it was nothing easy, as closing a book he'd lost interest in. The woman looked between them once, read the room the way perceptive people do, and murmured something Imani couldn't hear. Dae-Hyun said 3 words to her without looking away from his wife, and the woman gathered a small purse from the arm of the sofa and walked toward the private elevator, without making eye contact with either of them. The elevator doors closed. The penthouse went so quiet that Imani could hear the ventilation system. Dae-Hyun crossed the room toward her, and Imani held up one hand, not dramatically, not with anger, just a flat, open palm. Stop. He stopped, 4 feet between them. The distance felt like a country. Don't. Her voice was calm. Even she was surprised by how calm it was. Don't start talking yet. Don't tell me it wasn't what I think. Don't use words like complicated or context. Don't. She looked at him. Just looked. I need a minute to just look at you. Dae-Hyun said nothing, which was in its own terrible way a form of mercy. She looked at him. At the man who had walked into her cousin's restaurant, 8 years married, and before the wrong dish, and argued with her about it for 20 minutes, and then come back the next day and ordered it again, only to tell her he'd wanted an excuse to see her. At the man who had told her on their 3rd date, with a quietness that scared her, that he operated in spaces she might not be comfortable with, and who had sat across from her while she's decided, in real time, whether to walk away. At the man who had cried exactly once, in her presence at his mother's funeral, standing in the rain because he refused to stand under the canopy with everyone else, and who had let her be the only person to stand beside him in the rain that day. She had chosen him, repeatedly. Every year she had chosen him. Was it worth it? She asked. Not who is she or how long or why. Just that. The only question that actually mattered, because the answer to that one contained every other answer she would ever need. Dae-Hyun's jaw moved. She watched him try and fail to find the right words, watched the man who could negotiate with murderers and keep his voice flat as a highway become for just one moment completely undone. Imani, I'm not asking for an apology, she said. I'm asking if it was worth what you're about to lose. She looked at him one more time. Then she turned, walked to their bedroom, closed the door behind her without slamming it, and sat down on the edge of the bed in her stockinged feet. She sat there for a long time. She did not cry that night. She would cry later, much later, in the car on a Tuesday morning outside her own business, where no one could see her, but not that night. That night she just sat, very still, and thought about gardenias. Dae-Hyun Ryu had not become the most feared in Seoul underworld by being soft. He had built his empire from a starting position that most men would have used as an excuse to become nothing a father who disappeared before his 3rd birthday, a mother who worked herself into an early grave streets that had more teeth than opportunity. He had learned early that the world responded to strength, and so he had made himself into something the world couldn't ignore. By the time he was 32, he controlled 6 districts. By 35, he had legitimate businesses layered over the structure, like a clean suit over a bruise. By the time Imani came into his life, he was a man whom other powerful men called before making decisions, not because he was a partner, but because he was the kind of problem you wanted on your side. None of that prepared him for the kitchen the morning after. He'd spent the night in the guest room, not because Imani had told him to, she hadn't said anything, but because walking into that bedroom and lying down beside her felt like a violation he didn't know how to justify to himself. He had sat in the guest room in the dark and stared at the ceiling and turned over every possible version of what he could say to her, every angle of approach, every careful word, until he realized what he was actually doing. He was running strategy on his wife, on the woman who had sat beside him in a hospital waiting room for 9 hours when he'd taken a bullet to the shoulder and refused to tell her what actually happened. On the woman who had quietly learned enough Korean to have a conversation with his elderly aunt because the aunt didn't speak English, and Dae-Hyun hadn't thought to mention it before the dinner where they met. On the woman who had never once, in 11 years, asked him for anything she didn't also offer in return. He had run strategy on her, like she was an opponent. That thought followed him into the kitchen at 7 in the morning, like something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. The kitchen was empty. His coffee was on the counter. Already made, he didn't know if Imani had made it, or if the housekeeper had, and that uncertainty, that small stupid detail, hit him somewhere he wasn't prepared for. Because if she'd made it, she'd done it out of a habit she hadn't broken yet. And habits that haven't broken yet mean the person is still somewhere underneath the wound, still reaching for normal. He put his hand around the mug. Then he saw the envelope, white letter-sized. His name written on the outside in Imani's handwriting neat, unhurried. The same handwriting that had left him notes inside his coat pockets during the early years of their marriage. Little things. There's lunch in the car, or call your aunt. She's been asking about you. The kind of small gestures that accumulate over time into something enormous and invisible that you only recognize after it's gone. He knew before he opened it. He opened it anyway. The divorce papers were clean and complete and already signed. Dated the morning of, she must have had them prepared before today, which meant some part of her had been thinking about this before last night, which meant last night wasn't an isolated moment in an otherwise solid marriage. And that realization landed on him like weather. He set the papers back on the counter. He did not move for a long time. When Imani walked into the kitchen 40 minutes later, she was dressed, professional, composed in a way that was almost clinical. He recognized it because he had worn that same composure for most of his adult life, and seeing it on her face felt like looking in a mirror he had specifically broken. She poured herself coffee. She did not look at the counter where he'd left the envelope. She already knew it was there. Imani. He said her name carefully, the way you say something you're afraid of dropping. I heard you out there. She held her mug in both hands. Standing still for 40 minutes is not a response. Dae-Hyun. I'm not signing those. She looked at him then. No anger. No desperation. Something much more exhausting than either. Okay, she said simply. That's it? Okay? What do you want me to say? You don't have to sign them. Can't make you. She took a sip of her coffee. I can only tell you that I already have. You prepared those before last night. A pause, one beat. Then, I've been wondering for a while if I was staying out of love or out of familiarity. She set the mug down. Last night answered that question for me. The thing about that sentence was how quiet she said it. No accusation in it, no performance. She was simply reporting information, the way you tell a doctor, something that is going to change your treatment plan. It wasn't. He stopped himself before he said what you think, because she had specifically asked him not to, and he was not entirely without self-awareness. She doesn't mean anything to me. I know, Imani said. And that was somehow the worst possible response. Because she wasn't saying I know the way a person says it when they're relieved. She was saying it the way you say, I know, when the information confirms something you already understood, when the knowing actually makes everything more heartbreaking instead of less. She doesn't mean anything to you, which means you threw away something that meant everything for nothing at all. Then why? I'm not interested in the why right now. She picked up her keys from the hook beside the door. I have a meeting at 9. I'll have my assistant coordinate with yours about the logistics of. She paused. Recalibrated. That word logistics sat wrong, and she visibly felt it. About next steps. Imani, please. She stopped with her hand on the door frame. Didn't turn around. I was good to you, she said. Not a question. Not even a complaint. Just a fact she needed to say out loud. Maybe for herself as much as for him. For 11 years I was good to you. You were, he said. The words came out rough. You were the only person who ever... Don't. She turned then, looked at him once from across the kitchen, across the counter where the envelope sat, across all the distance that was no longer only geographical. Don't finish that sentence and make me sad for you. Not today. She walked out. The door didn't slam. That was the detail that stayed with him. She had walked out of their marriage, without slamming a single door, without raising her voice, without giving him anything to push back against. And he stood in the kitchen and understood for the first time in his adult life what it felt like to be genuinely, completely powerless. The weeks that followed had a shape he didn't recognize. He had expected anger from her, had prepared for it almost, the way you prepare for a storm you can see, coming on the radar. You brace, you board up the windows, you wait for it to hit, and then you deal with the aftermath. Anger he could work with. Anger was a conversation, and conversations had conclusions. Imani gave him no storm. She removed her wedding ring on a Friday and put it in a small dish on the bathroom counter, not thrown across the room, not dramatically left somewhere. He would find it as a message, just placed in the dish the way you place your earrings before washing your face. He found it there on Saturday morning and stood looking at it for longer than he would ever admit to another living person. She moved through the penthouse with the same quiet efficiency she always had. She continued running her catering company, a business she had built herself from a single commercial kitchen rental and a client list of 12, with the focused energy of someone who understood that work was something no one could take from her. She made calls, she attended meetings, she negotiated contracts, she tasted sauces at 7 in the morning, and sent back dishes that weren't right and stayed late when the kitchen team needed her. She was building. While her marriage came apart, she was building. Dae-Hyun watched this and felt something he could not immediately name. It took him several days to identify it. When he did, it landed poorly. It was respect. He had always respected her. He wasn't a man who would have married someone he didn't think highly of. But this was different. This was the specific respect that comes from watching someone you thought you knew reveal a capacity you hadn't fully measured. She was not falling apart. She was not leaning on him or circling back for comfort or using their mutual history as a tether. She was simply continuing, without him, with the same steadiness and quiet competence she had always brought to every corner of her life. He had assumed, somewhere in the architecture of his assumptions, that she needed him. Not in a cruel way, or at least, not consciously, but in the way you assume that someone who has been beside you for 11 years has organized some part of their weight around your presence. Imani had not. Or if she had reorganized quietly, the way competent people do, without announcing the work. Cut off contact with the woman from the penthouse. Completely. No explanation given, no negotiation, just a single message relayed through a third party. The way Dae-Hyun handled things he did not want to spend more words on than necessary. Done. Then he made the other calls. The ones he told himself were only practical. He quietly reached out to 3 distributors who'd been dragging their feet on Imani's catering contract renewals and made certain that foot dragging became a memory. He had a word with the property manager of the kitchen space. She was hoping to lease for expansion, and the conversation that had been stalled for 2 months suddenly resolved itself within a week. He sent her flowers. Twice. She sent them back with a note the second time, "Please stop. This isn't the way back." He sent a piece of jewelry. Something she'd admired once in a store window 2 years ago. Something he'd remembered without telling her he remembered. It came back in the same box, unopened. He transferred a significant amount of money into her personal account. She had her attorney send it back the same afternoon. Each return arrived with the same quiet finality as those divorce papers on the counter. No rage, no extended message, just no. Methodical, clean, consistent no. He sat in his office on a Wednesday evening, after the 4th return, and looked at the Seoul skyline through the window and thought about the fact that he controlled a great deal of what happened in this city. People moved when he indicated they should move. Decisions shifted when he applied pressure. Entire markets responded to his preferences. He had built that reality over 25 years through a combination of intelligence and relentlessness, and a willingness to do things that other men weren't willing to do. And his ex-wife, not yet legally, his ex-wife, but functionally. Yes, his wife was returning his money and his flowers and his jewelry with the same steady patience she brought to every task she took seriously. He could not buy his way back. He had never, until this moment, understood how completely that failure would undo him. What he didn't know, what he could not have known yet, was that across the city, in an apartment that Dae-Hyun had paid for, and that the woman who'd stood in his living room now occupied alone, something was being prepared that had nothing to do with heartbreak. The woman's name was Yeon Ji-song. She was 31 years old, precise in her movements, and she had entered Dae-Hyun's orbit 14 months ago through an introduction at an industry event that had not been accidental. She had a way of listening that made powerful men feel understood, and she understood exactly how valuable that ability was as a tool. She had spent 14 months building access, and now, cut off with no ceremony and no explanation, she was making a different kind of calculation entirely. She opened her laptop. She pulled up a folder she had been maintaining for almost a year, careful, documented, organized with the same patience she had used on everything else. Names, transactions, locations, the kind of information that in the right hands could do significant damage to an organization that depended on its secrets remaining secrets. She had a call to make, and the person on the other end of that call was going to be very interested in what she had to offer. Yeon Ji-song was not simply a woman who had been cut loose. She was the beginning of something that would eventually bring Dae-Hyun Ryu to the single, so important choice of his life. But first, he would have to lose a little more. And Imani Badu, standing in her commercial kitchen at 10:30 on a Thursday night, tasting a reworked lemongrass sauce and nodding slowly because it was finally right, had no idea that the worst part of this story had not yet arrived. She turned off the kitchen light. She locked the door behind her. She stood in the parking lot for a moment, keys in her hand, and breathed the night air. She was tired. She was still hurting in ways she was being very private about. But she was standing. She was working. She was still here, still building, still choosing herself with the same quiet consistency she had once poured into choosing him. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in a penthouse that still smelled like gardenias, Dae-Hyun Ryu sat alone, and finally began to understand the shape of what he had done. 3 weeks after Imani Badu walked out of her own kitchen without slamming a single door, Dae-Hyun Ryu stopped sleeping through the night. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of insomnia that announces itself with sweating and racing thoughts and the cinematic weight of a man in crisis. It was quieter and more corrosive than that. He would fall asleep at a reasonable hour, and then sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, he would simply be awake, eyes open, ceiling above him, the penthouse breathing its silent, expensive air around him with no specific thought to blame it on. Just awake. Just the particular emptiness of a large space that used to have another person in it. He had started leaving the television on in the living room, not watching it, just on. The sound of it carried down the hallway. It was a stupid thing, and he knew it was a stupid thing, and he did it anyway. He was in the kitchen at 5:45 on a Thursday morning, standing over his coffee when his phone rang. The name on the screen was Min Jae-oh, his second in command, his longest-serving operative, and one of perhaps 4 people on Earth that Dae-Hyun would take a call from at this hour without letting it go to voicemail. He picked up. "Tell me it's important. Someone's been moving information." Min Jae's voice had the particular flatness of a man who had been awake longer than Dae-Hyun had. Financial routing. 3 distribution nodes. Someone with access to internal sequencing. Dae-Hyun set his coffee down. How recent? The data trail goes back 11 months. I only caught it because one of our shell accounts in Busan flagged a pattern that didn't match our transaction rhythm. Small amounts. Careful spacing. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. 11 months. Dae-Hyun repeated the number not as a question, but as something he was holding up to the light, turning it, examining its shape. 11 months ago, he ran the calculation without wanting to. 11 months ago was 3 months after Yeon Ji-song had first appeared at that industry event. 3 months into what he had told himself was something entirely separate from his real life. "Send me what you have," he said. "Already sent." But Dae-Hyun, a pause. Min Jae did not pause unless he was choosing words with surgical care. This level of access, this wasn't someone who got lucky with a password. This was someone who was given proximity. The call ended. Dae-Hyun stood in the kitchen and looked at the dish beside the sink, the small ceramic dish where Imani used to drop her earrings in the morning before she washed her face. That was still sitting there because nobody had moved it, because he couldn't bring himself to move it, and he understood with the cold and clarifying certainty of a man whose instincts had kept him alive for 25 years that the thing happening inside his organization and the thing that had happened in his marriage were not separate problems. He just didn't have the full shape of it yet. Across the city, Imani was already at her commercial kitchen by 6:30, which was early even for her. She had a tasting for a corporate client at 9, a financial firm looking to book her company for their year-end events, and she wanted everything right. Not good. Right. There was a difference, and she felt it in her hands when she was working, that specific satisfaction of a thing done to its full capacity and not 1 degree less. Her sous chef, a sturdy, direct woman named Cora, who had been with her from the first year, was already prepping the cold station when Imani arrived. "You're early," Cora said, not looking up from her cutting board. "Couldn't sleep." "You haven't been sleeping, Cora." "I'm just making an observation." Cora set down her knife and looked at her boss with the specific frankness of someone who has earned the right to be direct. "You look like you're running on coffee and spite, and I say that with love. Spite is a legitimate fuel source." Imani tied on her apron. "How's the bisque?" "Needs 5 more minutes on the reduce." "The duck confit is resting. The dessert plating is your department." Cora watched her move to the stove. "You heard from him?" Imani didn't answer immediately. She lifted the lid on the bisque, checked the consistency, replaced the lid with the particular efficiency of someone who has redirected 100 conversations by simply staying in motion. He sent money to my account again, she said finally. Cora made a sound that was not quite a word. I sent it back. Good. It was a lot of money, Cora. I know. Cora picked her knife back up. Still good. Imani stirred the bisque. The kitchen was warm and smelled of roasted garlic and something sweet underneath the vanilla in the dessert reduction. The space was hers. She had scraped together the deposit for the lease herself, had negotiated the equipment financing herself, had built the client list one event at a time through referrals and reputation and the kind of stubbornness that people who haven't needed it tend to underestimate. Dae-Hyun had offered to fund the expansion twice. She had turned him down twice, not because she was making a point, though she understood, even at the time, that it carried the weight of one, but because she needed to know that this was hers. Fully. No strings running back to a man who signed things on her behalf. That foresight was sitting differently now, with a specific, rueful gratitude. Someone called the venue coordinator for the Jong account, Imani said. Her voice was neutral, informational. Apparently the conversation that had been stalled for 2 months just resolved itself, overnight. Cora set the knife down again. Dae-Hyun, I don't have proof. A beat. I don't need proof. What are you going to do? Imani turned off the burner under the bisque. Call the coordinator myself. Thank her. And then make absolutely clear that going forward my contracts are my contracts, and nobody with a different last name negotiates them. And if it's already done, then I undo it. She picked up a tasting spoon. I don't care if it costs me the account. Cora looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Just once. The kind of nod that means I see you, and I'm not going to argue. Tasting went well. The financial firm's event planner, a brisk, precise woman in her 40s, who asked specific questions and took actual notes, ate everything in front of her with the focused attention of someone conducting a genuine evaluation. And at the end of the meeting, she leaned back and said, This is the best food I've tasted in this budgetmeeting. And they shook hands over a preliminary agreement that would be the largest contract Imani's company had ever held. In the car on the way back to the kitchen, Imani sat in the passenger seat while Cora drove, and she allowed herself 45 seconds of feeling good about it. Quietly good. The specific private satisfaction of something earned. Then she thought about the venue coordinator, call, and the satisfaction curdled slightly at the edges. She pulled out her phone and dialed. The coordinator answered on the second ring, and was, as Imani had expected, carefully pleasant, in a way that confirmed everything. Yes, the lease terms had been finalized. Yes, the revised rate was in the contract she'd already emailed. Yes, everything was wonderful. Wonderful. A word used by people who want to end a conversation quickly. Imani asked, very directly, whether anyone other than her office had been in contact about the lease negotiation. A pause. Brief. One beat too long. Our office receives a lot of inquiries, the coordinator said. I'm sure you do, Imani said. I'm asking about this one specifically. Ms. Badu, the terms are in your favor. I don't see why. Because they're my terms to negotiate, Imani said. Not loudly. Not with heat. Whatever conversation happened without my knowledge, I need you to understand that it doesn't bind me. If those terms were reached because someone applied pressure on my behalf, I'll be renegotiating from the original position. That's not a threat, it's just how I operate. Silence. Then I'll have to check with my manager. Please do. Imani ended the call. Cora was quiet for a moment. Then that might cost you the space. I know. Good space, though. There are other spaces. Imani put her phone in her bag. There's only one reputation. That evening, Dae-Hyun sat across a table from Min Jae in a private room above one of his restaurants, a room that did not appear on any floor plan, that had no windows, and that had been swept for listening devices that morning, as it was every morning. Between them, on the table, was a laptop showing a series of financial documents with certain account numbers highlighted in yellow. 11 months, Dae-Hyun said again. Starting approximately 3 months after initial contact, Min Jae kept his voice level. The data packets were small enough to avoid our standard flags. Someone specifically calibrated the volumes to stay below threshold. That's not amateur work. Who knew about the threshold parameters? Our own people. and anyone who spent significant time with someone who did. Dae-Hyun looked at the screen, at the highlighted numbers, at the careful, patient architecture of a leak that had been running for almost a year while he'd been what? Distracted, compromised, using a word inside his own head that he applied without mercy to other men and had apparently failed to apply to himself when it counted. Where's the data going? Min-jae turned the laptop slightly, pulled up a second screen. The routing suggests Park Sung-il's operation. But you know Park, he doesn't commission this kind of work directly. It would have come through an intermediary. Park Sung-il, a name that sat in Dae-Hyun's chest like a stone he'd swallowed. They had been circling each other for 4 years, two men with overlapping interests and incompatible visions of how those interests should resolve, kept from open conflict mostly by the complexity of the network of alliances between them and the mutual understanding that direct confrontation was expensive for both sides. If Park had managed to put an operative inside Dae-Hyun's life for 11 months, close enough to collect the kind of information on that screen, then the Cold War between them had just become something different. Find out what was taken, Dae-Hyun said. Everything. Assume the worst and work backward. And her? Min-jae said it carefully, with the specific caution of a man who understood. He was walking near something that could remove his head. The woman. She's already gone. Dae-Hyun's voice didn't change. That was the most alarming thing about it. In Min-jae's experience, the moments when Dae-Hyun's voice went completely flat were not the calm moments. They were the moments when something had already been decided at a level below the conversation. Find out everything about how she was placed and who placed her. Full chain. I want names. Min-jae nodded. He closed the laptop. He started to rise. Min-jae. Dae-Hyun didn't look up from the table. Whatever you find, it doesn't change what I did. Make sure that's understood internally. If anyone in the organization tries to use this to rehabilitate my behavior in my marriage, I'll have a problem with that. Min-jae paused. That was not a sentence he had expected. He looked at his employer for a moment with the careful neutrality of a man who has survived 2 decades in a dangerous business by being very good at reading what people actually mean. Understood, he said. He left. Dae-Hyun sat alone in the windowless room and thought about the fact that an enemy had apparently calculated correctly that his marriage was the soft point, that the most efficient way to get inside his organization was not to attack his business relationships, or his security protocols, or any of the fortified external surfaces of the empire he'd spent his life constructing. It was to place a woman in his personal life and wait. They had read him accurately. That was the part that kept him still in his chair long after Min-jae had gone. Not the breach, not the data. The fact that someone out there had identified his marriage, had identified Imani as the vulnerability, and had been right. He had handed them the opening himself. Yeon Ji-song was, at that exact moment, not thinking about Dae-Hyun Ryu in any emotional sense. She was thinking about timelines. She sat in her apartment, still the one he'd paid for, the lease not yet expired, which she found useful in its own way, and she reviewed what she had given Park Sung-il's people and what she had held back. The held back portion was deliberate. She wasn't naive enough to hand over her entire inventory at once. Information given completely was information that no longer protected you. She had given Park's intermediary enough to demonstrate her access and establish her value, and she had retained enough to ensure that her own position remained negotiable. What she had not anticipated, and this was a miscalculation she was actively revising her plans around, was how cleanly Dae-Hyun had cut the connection. No conversation, no attempt at negotiation or damage control, no message through intermediaries suggesting she might be useful to keep close. Just silence. The door closed and no handle on her side. That silence told her something important. He already suspected. Maybe not the full shape of it, but enough. Which meant her window was narrowing. She picked up her phone and sent a message to the intermediary. 7 words. I'm ready to move to the next phase. The response came in under 3 minutes, which told her that on the other end, someone had been waiting. Imani found out about the lease coordinator's decision 3 days later. The space had gone to another client. The coordinator's email was professionally worded and twice as long as it needed to be, which was how you could tell it had been run past a lawyer first. She read it once, set her phone on her desk, and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she forwarded it to her own attorney, with a note for the file. No action needed. and she started making calls about alternative kitchen spaces. She had 2 leads by end of day. Neither was as good as the first option had been. One of them might become something with time and negotiation and the specific patience she had been developing, apparently, her entire adult life. She was on the phone with the second property contact when her assistant, a young man named Theo, who was efficient and discreet in a way she'd come to depend on, knocked on her office door and leaned in. "There's a woman here," he said. "She doesn't have an appointment. She says she knows you." But he hesitated. "She says she's there to give you information." "About your husband." Imani kept the phone to her ear, finished her sentence to the property contact. "Made the appointment for Friday." Then she set the phone down and looked at Theo. "What's her name?" Theo checked the card in his hand. Yeon Ji-sung. The room was very quiet for a moment. Imani thought, in rapid succession, about saying no, about how she'd been conducting herself these past weeks, which was specifically not confrontation, not direct engagement with the wreckage, not sitting across a table from a woman who had stood in her living room, with her husband's hand on her back. She thought about what it would cost her emotionally to have that conversation. She thought about what it might cost her not to. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. "Then send her in." When Yeon Ji-sung walked into Imani's office, Imani was behind her desk, seated with the posture of someone who had decided in advance not to stand up. That was deliberate. She understood the geometry of the room, and she was not going to surrender it. Yeon Ji was precisely as put together as Imani had expected. She was also, Imani noted without satisfaction, nervous, a fact she was successfully hiding behind a very good performance, but the fingertips on her right hand were pressing against her thumb in a repetitive motion she probably didn't know she was doing. "Ms. Badu." She sat in the chair across the desk without being invited to, which told Imani something. "I know you have no reason to talk to me." "That's accurate." Imani's voice was completely even. "So you should probably say whatever you're here to say without preamble, because you have maybe 4 minutes before I decide. My time is better spent elsewhere." Yeonji's jaw tightened slightly. She had prepared for hostility. Imani could see, had prepared an approach designed to work around it. What she hadn't fully prepared for, apparently, was this specific kind of calm. It threw her slightly off her sequence. "The relationship between myself and your husband," she started. "Ex-husband," Imani said. A pause. "The divorce isn't finalized. He hasn't signed. That's a legal status, not a reflection of reality." Imani looked at her steadily. 2 minutes. Yeonji recalibrated. "I was placed," she said, "in his life. Intentionally. I was approached 14 months ago by a contact who worked for Park Sung's organization and given a specific brief. Get close to Dae-Hyun Ryu. Collect information. Pass it through a specified channel." Imani said nothing. Her expression did not change. "I want you to understand that the personal element—" "I don't care about the personal element." Imani said it without cruelty, but without any softness either. "You were a professional performing a function. That's not what I'm interested in." She leaned forwards slightly. "Why are you here? Why are you telling me this?" Another recalibration. Yeonji was very fast, she'd give her that. "Because I'm positioned to become unnecessary to Park's operation very shortly. Once the information I provided has been used, my leverage disappears. I need an alternative arrangement." She paused. "Dae-Hyun's organization has resources. So does yours. And you have something I need more than money, which is distance." Yeonji's voice dropped slightly, not for effect, Imani thought, but because this particular word carried actual weight. "I need to be somewhere else before this accelerates. And I need documentation of what I provided to Park's people, documentation that protects me, because right now the only person who knows the full scope is me." "You want protection," Imani said. "I want an exit." Imsani sat back in her chair. She looked at the woman across from her, really looked, the way she'd been doing her whole life, with people who came to her wanting things, the specific assessment she'd developed through years of running a business and navigating a marriage to a man whose world was built on surfaces. She was looking for the version of this that was true. Not completely true. Nobody came into a room like this telling the complete truth, but the core of it. The part underneath the strategy. What she found underneath the strategy was someone who was genuinely scared. That didn't make her sympathetic, exactly, but it made her realistic. "I'm not my husband's organization," Imani said carefully. "I can't offer you what you're describing." "I know." Yeonji met her eyes. But you could tell him, and he would listen to you in a way he wouldn't listen to anyone else. Even now. Silence. Imani looked at the woman who had stood with Dae-Hyun's hand on her back in that living room, on that anniversary, and felt something. Not what she'd expected to feel. Not rage. Not the vindictive satisfaction of watching a consequence arrive. Just a complicated, exhausting recognition that the world had very few clean situations, and this was not one of them. "Leave your contact information with my assistant," she said finally. "I'm not promising anything. I'm not even promising I'll think about it beyond today." Yeonji nodded. She stood. She was at the door when Imani said, "Did you know? When you started. Did you know about me, specifically about our marriage?" Yeonji stopped, her hand on the doorframe. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, the performance dropped slightly, just enough. "Yes," she said. "The marriage was the point. You were the briefing described you as the primary vulnerability. The relationship he wouldn't think clearly about." She left. Imani sat very still. She had known, abstractly, since the night in the kitchen, that something in her marriage had broken down long before she walked through that door. She had known that Dae-Hyun's capacity of compartmentalization, a trait she had excused and rationalized in ways she wasn't proud of, had been the mechanism that made the betrayal possible. She had understood all of that, but this was different. This was sitting in her office, being told that her marriage had been a target, that whoever had placed Yeonji in Dae-Hyun's path had looked at Imani Badu, at everything she'd built inside that life, at 11 years of choice and commitment and quiet, sustained love, and had seen an opening. She picked up her phone. She called the one person she trusted completely, which was not Dae-Hyun and had not been for some time. "I need to see you," she said when her older sister Adeze answered. "Tonight. Not on the phone. Are you okay?" Imani thought about that question for a moment. She thought about the kind of answer that was honest without being dramatic, that reflected the actual state of things without either softening it or performing it. "I'm standing," she said. "That's the most accurate thing I can tell you right now." She heard Adeze breathe. "I'll be there by 7. Imani set the phone down. She looked at the wall. She thought about what Yeonji had said. You were the primary vulnerability, the relationship he wouldn't think clearly about. And she thought about all the years of loving Dae-Hyun carefully, specifically, with both eyes open, the way you love a complicated person when you've decided they're worth the complication. His enemies had looked at that love and seen a weapon. And the man who claimed to love her had handed them the ammunition without knowing it. Yes, but also without being careful enough, without valuing what they had built carefully enough to make himself hard to reach. That was what she sat with as the afternoon light moved across her office wall. Not the betrayal as a personal wound. Not anymore. But the specific, cold shape of the fact that the life she had invested 11 years in had been visible from the outside as a weak point, and that the man at the center of it had not protected it, had not protected her. In a restaurant across the city, Dae-Hyun's phone lit up with a message from a number he didn't recognize. 4 words. "She came to me." He read it twice. Then he pulled up his call history and dialed Min-jae. "She went to Imani," he said when Min-jae answers. A silence on the other end that said several things at once. Then when? "Today, I assume. I just got the message." He looked at the 4 words on his screen. He's positioning herself. She wants something. What she has could do significant damage if she releases it publicly. "I know what she has." His voice was very flat now. The flatness that Min-jae had learned over 20 years was not calm. "But she went to Imani. That's not a business move. That's a message to me, a beat. She wants me to know that my ex-wife is now inside this." "What do you want to do?" Dae-Hyun was quiet for a moment. Outside the restaurant window, the city moved through its evening, the way cities do indifferently, continuously, with no particular concern for the people inside it having moments that would change the entire direction of what came next. "Get me everything on the contact chain between her and Park's people," he said. "Full documentation. I want to know exactly who gave her the brief and what they told her about my marriage." His hand tightened on the phone. "And I want it tonight." He ended the call. He looked at the 4 words on his screen. "She came to me." Imani had not called him, had not sent a message, which meant she'd received whatever Yeonji had brought her. And she was processing it alone, the way she processed everything alone, the way she processed everything alone now. the way she had apparently been processing things for longer than he'd realized. He thought about calling her. He picked up his phone and looked at her name in its contacts and thought about what he would say. What words existed for this specific situation, for being the man who had broken his own marriage through carelessness, and then discovered the carelessness had been engineered, partially, by someone who understood exactly where to apply pressure. He didn't call. Because the truth, the part he was being extremely uncomfortable with, in the privacy of his own chest, was that the engineering didn't change the essential fact. Yeon Ji-sung had been placed in his life deliberately, and that was real. But Dae-Hyun had made choices inside that placement, had made them consciously and freely, and with full knowledge of what he had at home. Nobody had put his hand on her back. He set his phone face down on the table. Across the city, in Imani's apartment, Adeze Badu sat with her younger sister on the couch and listened to the whole of it without interrupting once, which was a significant act of patience for a woman who had been inserting herself into Imani's problems since they were children. When Imani finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So his enemies used you as the door?" "Yes." Imani had her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "And now this woman wants something from you. She wants me to be a bridge to Dae-Hyun's organization." Imani looked at her sister. "She thinks I still have influence over him." "Do you?" A long silence. "I don't know," Imani said honestly. "And that's what bothers me most." She set the mug down. "Because if she's right, if he would move for me, in ways he wouldn't move for anyone else, then what I choose to do right now has consequences that go way past my own marriage." Adeze looked at her carefully. "You're thinking about doing it. I'm thinking about all of it." Imani shook her head slightly. "I'm thinking about the fact that whatever is about to happen between Dae-Hyun and Park Sung-sil is going to be bad. And I'm thinking about whether staying completely outside it is actually possible for me, or whether this woman walking into my office today means I'm already inside it, whether I wanted to be or not." Adeze reached over and took her sister's hand, held it. "What do you want?" she said. "Just that. Simple. Direct." Imani looked at the window, at the city lights beyond it, at the version of her life that existed out there, outside these walls, her kitchen, her contracts, the business she was building one careful decision at a time. "I want it to have been straightforward," she said quietly. "I want it to have just been a man who made a selfish choice and a marriage that ended. I could have handled that cleanly." Her jaw tightened slightly. "This is not clean." "No," Adeze said, "it's not." They sat together in the quiet. And somewhere across the city, in a car parked 3 blocks from Imani's building, a man who worked for Park Sung-il's organization sat with a camera and a file that was almost complete. The last item he needed to add to that file, the piece that would make the fabricated evidence against Imani Badu look not just plausible, but airtight, had just walked out of her office and was currently answering a phone. Call that she did not realize was being monitored. The trap was not yet closed, but every element was now in position. And the moment Dae-Hyun Ryu received the full picture of what had been built around him, around his marriage, around the woman he had failed, he would have to make a choice that his entire life had been moving toward, without him knowing it. The file arrived at 2:17 in the morning. Dae-Hyun was still awake, had not tried to sleep, had been sitting at the desk in his home office, with the city laid out below him like a circuit board, all those lit windows and moving cars, all those lives running their separate tracks through the dark. Min-jae sent it without a message attached, which was how Min-jae communicated when the content was bad enough. The words around it felt wasteful. Dae-Hyun opened it. He read for 11 minutes without moving, without touching his coffee, without blinking more than he had to. Just reading, with the focused stillness of a man who has trained himself over decades to receive difficult information, without letting his body react before his mind has fully processed what it's receiving. At the end of 11 minutes, he closed the laptop, put both hands flat on the desk, stared at the wall. Then he opened the laptop again and read the last section a second time, because the first time he had read it, he had understood the words, but some of him had refused to fully absorb their arrangement. The way certain sentences, when they contain something truly catastrophic, require a second pass before they become real. The file contained the full documentation of Yeon Ji-sung's operational brief, Min Jae's people had been thorough. The chain went from Yeonji back through 2 intermediaries to a logistics coordinator inside Park Sung-il's organization named Baek Tae-won. A man Dae-Hyun knew by reputation as someone who specialized in what the industry euphemistically called social engineering. Baek was good. 20 years of placing the right people in the right rooms at the right time. That part Dae-Hyun had already anticipated. What he had not anticipated was the second file nested inside the first. A sub-package compiled separately that Min Jae had flagged with a single asterisk. The kind of flag Min Jae used when he wanted to mark something as, "This is the part you need to be sitting down for." The sub-package contained fabricated evidence, not rough fabrication. Not the kind that falls apart under moderate scrutiny. Kind built by professionals who understood the difference between evidence that looks real and evidence that is structurally indistinguishable from real. The kind that had been assembled over months using real documents, real dates, real transaction codes from Dae-Hyun's own organization, rearranged and annotated and attributed to someone who had never touched them. The someone was Imani Badu. The fabricated record presented Imani as a secondary operative, a woman who had, over a period of 14 months, been feeding information about her husband's organization to an outside party. Her name appeared on 7 documents. Her business account number appeared on 2 transfer records. There was a manufactured email chain that had been constructed to look as though it originated from a server connected to her catering company. The record was designed to answer the obvious question that any sophisticated observer would ask when Park Sung-il eventually moved against Dae-Hyun's organization with knowledge he shouldn't have. How did he get inside? The answer, according to the fabricated file, was Dae-Hyun's own wife. It was a construction of devastating elegance, because it was not just about destroying Imani. It was about destroying Dae-Hyun's credibility within his own world. A man whose wife had been selling his secrets. A man who had been compromised at the most intimate level. A man whose judgment could not be trusted, because the person he trusted most had been working against him for over a year. In the world Dae-Hyun operated in, that story once circulated would do more damage than any physical assault. Alliances would dissolve. Loyalties would recalculate. The carefully maintained architecture of fear and respect that he had spent 25 years building would develop fractures that no amount of money or force could repair. And Imani, who was in her kitchen right now, probably, or asleep in an apartment that was entirely her own. Entirely separate from all of this, Imani would be the name attached to the wound. He called Min Jae. Min Jae answered on the first ring. Also awake. Of course. You saw the second file, Min Jae said. Not a question. How complete is it? Complete enough. If Park's people move in the next 2 to 3 weeks, before we can build a counter-narrative, it lands. Not with everyone, but with enough. A pause. The transfer records are the problem. They used a real account number from her business. Anyone who checks will find the account exists and is active. The burden of proof shifts. She has nothing to do with this. I know that. Min Jae's voice was absolutely level. The people Park will be showing this to don't know her. They know your organization's security history, and they will be looking at documentation that has been built to withstand initial scrutiny. Another pause, shorter. Dae-Hyun. If this circulates before we can respond, your ability to protect her from the consequences is significantly reduced. Dae-Hyun did not answer immediately. He was doing the specific thing he did when a situation required him to think past his own emotional reaction, not suppressing it. Exactly. But setting it aside in a particular internal compartment, the way you close a door. Not because you're abandoning what's behind it, but because you need to work in a room where it isn't distracting you. What's our current window? Based on the operational pattern, the way they've been pacing this, I'd estimate 7 to 10 days before they make their move. They'll want the evidence package delivered at a moment of maximum visibility, an assembly of some kind. Park has a standing meeting with the 5 Northern District heads scheduled in 9 days. 9 days. Pull everything we have on Baek Tae-won, Dae-Hyun said. I want to know where he is physically. I want to know who his current contacts inside my organization are. And I want to know whether Yeonji has communicated with him since she went to Imani's office. Already running. And Min Jae. Dae-Hyun's voice dropped half a register. Not softer. Colder. The people who built that second file, Imani's name, her account numbers, the fabricated chain. I want those people identified separately, not as part of Park's organization, as individuals, by name. Min-jae understood what that meant. Understood. Dae-Hyun ended the call. He sat for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done in weeks. He pulled up Imani's contact in his phone and looked at it. Just looked. At her name on the screen. At the small round photograph, beside it, a picture she didn't know he'd saved. Taken at a dinner 2 years ago, when she'd been laughing at something her sister said, head slightly turned. The natural, unself-conscious quality of her face when she wasn't aware of being looked at. He did not call. He put the phone face down. He could not call her at 2 in the morning to tell her that her name had been forged onto documents connecting her to a criminal conspiracy. He could not do that, not because he was protecting her from the information, but because she had been very clear about the terms of their current relationship, which was no relationship, and calling her in the middle of the night would breach those terms in a way that the information did not justify. She would find out, in the right way at a reasonable hour, in a context that allowed her to respond rather than just react. He would make sure of that. What he did instead was pull out a legal pad actual paper, because certain things he did not want on any screen, and begin writing names. He wrote for 40 minutes. When he stopped, the page had 12 names on it, and a series of connections mapped between them in his own particular shorthand, the compressed notation system he'd developed over years, because it was faster than language and legible only to himself. He looked at the map. Then he circled one name near the bottom, Han Soo-young, a mid-level coordinator in his own organization who had been in his employ for 3 years, who managed logistics for the Southern Distribution Network, and whose access level would have given Yeon Jae-song, through a sustained relationship, exactly the caliber of information that had appeared in Min-jae's documentation. He had trusted Han Soo-young implicitly. He had trusted him because Min-jae had recommended him, and Min-jae did not make careless recommendations, and in 3 years the man had given him no reason to reconsider. He had eaten at Dae-Hyun's table. He had attended the quiet, informal meetings that only people with a certain level of trust were invited to. He had 3 months ago, at an organizational dinner that Imani had attended, sat across from Dae-Hyun's wife and been introduced as someone Dae-Hyun relied on. If Han had been the internal contact, if Yeonji had reached him not through Dae-Hyun, but through the organization's own structure, using Dae-Hyun as the visible target while the actual pipeline ran through someone else, then the breach was deeper than Min-jae had initially estimated. Dae-Hyun put the pen down. He picked it up again. He drew a line from Han Soo-young's name to Baek Tae-won's name, with a question mark between them. Then he sat back and looked at what he had drawn and thought about the word trust, about all the places he had applied it, and all the ways it had been used as a surface to slide something underneath. At 7:30 the next morning, Dae-Hyun walked into the offices of his legitimate business holdings on the 24th floor of a building in Gangnam, and he asked his assistant to arrange a meeting with Han Soo-young at 9 o'clock. He said it the way he said everything work-related, without inflection, without any indication of the specific gravity of the request, in the same voice he used to arrange catering orders and contract reviews. Han arrived at 9:03. He was 34 years old, compact and well-dressed, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from 3 years of successfully making yourself useful to a powerful person. He sat across from Dae-Hyun in the glass-walled conference room and arranged himself in the chair with the body language of a man who expected this to be a routine check-in. Dae-Hyun let him sit in that assumption for 30 seconds. Then he put Min-jae's documentation on the table and turned it to face Han. The change in the room was immediate and physical. It was not that Han's expression collapsed. He was better trained than that, or at least he thought he was. But there was a quality of stillness that arrived in his body that had not been there before, the specific cessation of the micro-movements of a person who is comfortable and suddenly becomes someone who is not. And Dae-Hyun had been reading that particular shift for 25 years, and he could not be fooled by the face when the body was giving a different answer. "Take your time," Dae-Hyun said. Han took 70 seconds to read the first page. Dae-Hyun counted them. Then Han looked up with an expression that had been carefully arranged into something that was trying to be confused and was landing instead as studied. I don't understand what I'm looking at, Han said. Then look again. Han looked at the page again, this time for about 15 seconds. Then he set it down with the controlled deliberateness of someone managing their own hands. This is someone put together a chain that suggests I had contact with Song Yeon-ji outside of. Stop. Dae-Hyun's voice was quiet, not raised, not heated. The particular quiet that happens when a room has been completely drained of its air. I've been doing this for a very long time. I know what it looks like when a man is deciding which version of a story to tell. I'm asking you not to do that. He let the silence sit for a moment. I'm not asking whether you did it. I know whether you did it. I'm asking you to decide how this conversation goes from here. Han was quiet. His right hand moved slightly on the table, fingers pressing together. The same motion, Dae-Hyun noted distantly, that Yeonji Song had been making in Imani's office. People repeated themselves in their tells. It was one of the most reliable things about human beings. I need to know one thing, Dae-Hyun said. The second file. The one with my wife's name on it. He watched Han's face with the particular attention of a man who is not interested in the performance. Did you know that was part of the package? The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. In Dae-Hyun's experience, 4 seconds was an extremely long silence for an innocent person to produce in response to that question. I didn't know the specifics, Han said finally. His voice had changed. The easy confidence was completely gone, now replaced with something stripped and functional. I knew there was going to be a narrative. I didn't know it involved Mrs. Ryu directly, Ms. Badu, Dae-Hyun said. Han looked at him. Her name is Imani Badu. She's not Mrs. Ryu. A beat. What did you know? Han looked down at the table, at the documentation, at the evidence of his own actions laid out in Min Jae's precise formatting. He seemed to be doing the same calculation Dae-Hyun had done in the guest room on the night of the anniversary, running through versions, looking for the one that would serve him best. They told me it would destabilize the organization, Han said, shift the balance of the Northern network. I was offered a position. After the restructuring, he stopped. They offered you a chair at the new table, Dae-Hyun said. Yes, and you believe they'd honor that. Han said nothing, which was, in its own way, an answer. He was 34 years old, and he had made a calculation that was either ambitious or desperate, and he had made it while sitting at Dae-Hyun's table and eating Dae-Hyun's food and looking across a dinner table at Imani Badu, and now he's sitting here with the results of that calculation arranged in front of him. Dae-Hyun stood up. He straightened his jacket. He picked up the documentation from the table. He looked at Han Soo-young for a moment with the particular quality of attention that was not anger, was beyond anger, had moved through anger to somewhere much colder and more deliberate. You will be moved to a secure location, he said. You will not be harmed. You will be asked questions by Min Jae, and you will answer them fully, and everything you give us will be verified. He paused at the door. If everything you give us is accurate and complete, the secure location will stop being necessary within a reasonable period of time. He did not specify what a reasonable period meant. He did not need to. If it isn't accurate and complete, the situation becomes more complicated for both of us. Han nodded, the nodding of a man who understands he has run out of moves. Dae-Hyun left the room. He walked down the hallway and into the elevator and stood in the descending box with his jaw set and his hands loose at his sides, and he thought about 9 days. He thought about what Park Sung-gil would do with that fabricated file. He thought about Imani's face in the kitchen, not the night of, but the morning after, when she'd been so composed it was frightening, when she had said, "I was good to you," in that flat, factual way that had reached into his chest and rearranged something that had never been fully put back. He thought about her name on those forged documents, her business account number, her name, the specific, targeted malice of building a weapon out of the most identifiable parts of a person, the things that represented what they had built, what they were proud of, what they had made out of their own persistence and skill, and using those things as the material for a lie. The elevator doors opened. He called Min Jae. Han is in custody, he said, walking through the lobby without looking at anything. Get someone to him within the hour. Already arranged. I anticipated. Of course you did. He pushed through the building's glass doors into the morning. The city was loud and moving and completely uninterested in him. I need a meeting, not here. Not the restaurant. The place in Muppo. When? Tonight. I need the 3 people I trust most in the same room, and I need to make a decision before Park moves. He stopped on the sidewalk. A woman walked around him without looking up from her phone. And I need someone to reach out to Yeon-ji Song. Pause. Reach out how? She came to Imani because she wants an exit. She has documentation on the operational chain. She said so herself. And I believe it because she's not stupid enough to give away everything at once. He watched a taxi pull away from the curb. I want to know exactly what she's held back and what she wants for it. You want to use her. I want to give her the exit she's looking for and get the documentation in exchange. What she has corroborates what we already have. Together, it might be enough, he paused, for what I'm thinking of doing, which is, I'll explain tonight. He started walking again. Min Jae, the people who put Imani's name on those documents. Do we have them yet? 2 of the 3. The 3rd is still running. I want all 3 by tonight. Dae-Hyun. Min Jae said his name with the specific weight of a man who is preparing to say something he has evaluated carefully before saying, whatever you're planning the scale of it. I want to understand whether you're thinking about this as an organizational problem or as something else. Dae-Hyun stopped walking again. A car horn somewhere behind him, the city said. It started as an organizational problem, but they put her name on those papers. His voice stayed flat, but Min Jae knew, after 20 years, exactly what the flatness covered. Nobody gets to use Imani to come at me. Not Park, not Bake, not anyone. A beat. This stopped being just business when they decided she was a useful surface. He ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked to his car. What Dae-Hyun did not know, could not know yet, was that 40 minutes earlier at 6:50 in the morning, Imani Badu had received a visitor. She had been in her kitchen. Her actual kitchen, her apartment kitchen, not the commercial one making coffee, in the quiet of an early morning that belonged entirely to herself, wearing an oversized shirt and no shoes, with her hair still loose, in the half-awake state that is the most honest version of a person, before the day's requirements have fully assembled themselves. The knock at her door was not her buzzer. It was the door itself, which meant someone had come through the building's front entrance without buzzing up, which meant someone in the building had let them in, or someone had a key card they shouldn't have. She set her coffee down. She stood in the kitchen and did not immediately move to the door. Instead, she looked around the room with the specific, quiet attention of a woman who had been married to a dangerous man for 11 years and had absorbed, osmotically, the habit of noting exits. The knock came again, 3 times. Measured spacing. Not urgent, but not soft. She went to the door, looked through the peephole. 2 men, both in dark coats, neither face she recognized. She did not open the door, Ms. Badu. The voice through the door was calm, professionally calibrated the voice of someone who understood that the tone of a first sentence determined whether the next 10 minutes were going to be productive. My name is Choi Won-suk. I work for Park Sung-il. I'm not here to threaten you. I have some documents I think you should see before your husband sees them. Ex-husband, she thought. The reflex was automatic now. She did not say anything. We know about the visit from Song Yeon-ji, the voice continued. We know what she told you, and we know what she was trying to accomplish. I think you deserve the full picture before that situation develops further. A pause. The full picture involves your name, Ms. Badu. Specifically, documentation that is about to become very public, and that will be very difficult for you to address without understanding what it says. Her hand was very still on the door handle. She thought about Adese's voice from 2 nights ago. What do you want? Simple. Direct. She thought about Yeon-ji Song in her office, with her fingers pressing together. She thought about 11 years of building a life inside a world that had edges she had always known about, and chosen not to look at directly. The edges were now looking at her. She opened the door. Choi Won-suk was in his 50s, gray at the temples, with the bearing of a man who spent a lot of time in rooms where things were decided. The man behind him was younger, held a thin folder, said nothing. May we come in? Choi asked. She stepped back from the door. They came in. She did not offer them coffee or chairs. She stood in the middle of her living room with her arms loose at her sides and looked at the older man and said, "Show me?" The younger man opened the folder and set it on her coffee table. Imani looked down at it. She read the top document. Then she picked up the folder and read the second document, and the third, and the fourth, and the fabricated email chain, and the 2 transaction records with her business account number on them, and she read all of it standing up in her bare feet, in the morning quiet of her apartment, without making a sound. When she was finished, she set the folder back on the table. She looked at Choi Won-suk. "This is fabricated," she said. "Yes," he said. "With the particular ease of someone confirming information, they have no investment in contesting. We know that. The question is whether the people who will see it can distinguish fabrication from reality within the time frame your husband has to respond." "Ex-husband, yes." He did not blink. "The question stands." She looked at him for a moment. The calculation he was presenting was clear. He was not pretending it wasn't. He was here because Park Sung-il wanted her to understand the shape of what was coming, which meant Park wanted something from her response to it. People did not come to your door at 7 in the morning to give you information without wanting something back. "What does Park Sung-il want?" she said directly. Choi looked almost appreciative. Almost. "He wants Dae-Hyun Ryu to understand that this particular conflict has a resolution that doesn't require total destruction." The flash drive went to Min-jae at 9:17 that evening. By 10:40, Min-jae had processed the recording and cross-referenced the audio against the existing documentation chain with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that the window between now and tomorrow night was not a window so much as a crack, and that everything they needed had to fit through it before it closed. Dae-Hyun sat at the conference table and listened to the recording twice. The first time he listened for content, for the names, the specific language of the brief, the operational instructions. The second time, he listened to the part where Baek Taewon's intermediary, a man named Shin, whose voice was smooth and unhurried in the way of someone who had delivered this kind of briefing many times before, described Imani Badu's role in the operational plan. Not Imani as a target, not Imani as collateral, Imani as architecture, as the structural element around which the entire approach had been built. The wife is the primary access mechanism. Ryu's organizational discipline does not extend to the personal sphere. His capacity for compartmentalization is a liability in this context because it means he has not fully integrated the personal risk into his threat assessment. The marriage is the gap. Use it. Dae-Hyun stopped the recording. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set, and he breathed through his nose slowly, the way he breathed when something had reached through the controlled surface and grabbed something underneath. Min-jae watched him and said nothing. Imani was at the far end of the table with a legal pad writing. She had been writing since she arrived, not notes, exactly, but something more structured. She had asked Min-jae for the full list of people who would be present at Park's assembly tomorrow night, and Min-jae had given it to her, and she was doing something with that list that neither man had asked her about because they had both independently decided that asking might stop it. At 11:30, Dae-Hyun looked up and said, "We need to talk about tomorrow." "We need to talk about it now," Min-jae says, which was as close as he ever came to urgency. They talked about it. The assembly was set for 8 in the evening at a private facility in Gangnam-gu, a members' club that occupied the top 3 floors of a building whose lower floors were a legitimate hotel, kind of layered arrangement that Seoul's underworld had perfected over decades. 23 people had been confirmed. District heads, alliance partners, 3 men who served as bridges between Dae-Hyun's network and operations in 2 other cities. Park Sung-il had framed the assembly as a routine coordination meeting. The fabricated evidence package, including the file with Imani's name, was designed to be produced mid-meeting, presented as intelligence that had come to Park's attention and that the assembled parties had a right to know about given their shared interests with Dae-Hyun's organization. The setup was elegant in its specificity. Park was not going to accuse Dae-Hyun directly. He was going to present evidence of a breach, express concern, let the assembled parties draw their own conclusions, and watch as 23 people recalibrated their relationship with Dae-Hyun based on a file that said his wife had been selling them out for over a year. "He's not making a power move," Min-jae said. "He's making a credibility move. He wants them to doubt Dae-Hyun's judgment without Park having to say it directly. If I don't go, it runs unopposed." Min-jae's voice was completely flat. 23 people received the package with no counter-narrative. By morning, the story is established. And if I go with incomplete counter-documentation, then the fabrication is partially countered. which means it's still partially present. Min-jae paused. With Yeonji's recording, we have the full chain. The documentation is complete enough now. The question is not whether we have sufficient material. He looked at Dae-Hyun. Question is whether you can present it in a room where Park Sung-il is simultaneously trying to undermine everything you say. Park will be there. Park will be there, Min-jae confirmed. Dae-Hyun nodded once. He had known that. He had been building toward the reality of it since the phone call that afternoon. Park Sung-il in the same room with 23 people between them and an evidence package designed to destroy the foundation of everything Dae-Hyun had built. He looked at the end of the table. Imani had stopped writing. She was looking at the legal pad with the expression of someone reviewing completed work, checking it against an internal standard. "What is that?" he asked. She looked up. "The names on your list." The 23 people. She turned the legal pad around. 11 of them have used catering services connected to mine in the last 2 years. 3 of them through direct contracts with my company. The other 8 through event management firms that subcontracted to my kitchen. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not unknown to the people in that room." A silence. Min-jae looked at the legal pad, then at Dae-Hyun. "You're not going to that assembly," Dae-Hyun said. "I'm not asking for permission," Imani said, with no heat in it. Just the simple factual quality she brought to statements that were not open for discussion. "I have standing in that room that is entirely independent of you. My name is on documents that will be presented in that room. I have more right to be present than half the people on that list." She held his gaze. "And I'm not going to sit somewhere else while people decide what the truth is about me. Imani, these are not, I know what they are." She kept her voice even. "I've known what they are for 11 years. Don't manage me right now." She picked up the legal pad. "Min-jae, can we get me in?" Min-jae looked at her, then at Dae-Hyun. The look of a man positioned between 2 forces that both significantly outweighed him. "The assembly is invitation-based," Min-jae said carefully. "It's Park's event. Getting an uninvited guest in the facility depends on the physical layout and the security arrangement." He paused. "Which I know in detail, because we use the same facility for our own purposes 4 times a year." Dae-Hyun stared at him. Min-jae met the stare without expression. "I am presenting the available information," said. "What is done with it is not my decision." The night ran on. They worked through it in the conference room until 2 in the morning, the documentation, the sequencing, the specific order in which the counter-evidence would need to be presented for maximum effect before Park could respond. Min-jae was a man who understood the architecture of a persuasive argument the way a structural engineer understands load-bearing walls, where to put the weight, what could not be moved, where the whole thing would collapse if one element failed. At 1:40, Dae-Hyun went to get coffee from the kitchen, off the main office, and Imani followed him. Not because she needed coffee. He knew that, and she knew he knew that. He poured 2 cups, set one on the counter near her without turning around. She picked it up. They stood in the small kitchen, with the hum of the building's overnight systems around them, and the particular quiet of 2 people who have too much to say, and have agreed, without discussing it, to not say most of it right now. "You should sleep," he said. "A few hours." "So should you." "I don't sleep well." "I know." She held the cup in both hands. "You haven't for years. You just hit it better before." He turned around, looked at her. There was something in the quality of the look that was different from the controlled assessment she had been receiving from him all evening, something with less architecture around it. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "The call to Yeonji. Coming here tonight. I know that too. I'm not saying it so you'll disagree," he said. "I'm saying it because," he stopped. "Reset. Because I understand that nothing I did deserved this from you. The help. Your name is on those papers because of choices I made, and you're here building the case that counters them, and I'm aware of exactly how little I deserve that." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm not here for you," she said, plainly, without cruelty. "I'm here for my name and my business, and the version of myself that those documents turned into a lie. That's a separate thing from you, I know. But," she paused, "you were right about what you said earlier, that you won't let Park's version of events stand. I believe that." She looked at the coffee in her hands. "That doesn't fix what happened between us. It doesn't come close, but I believe it." He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not land wrong in this kitchen at 2 in the morning. Nothing that wouldn't be either too much or an evasion of what too much actually meant. She set her cup down and went back to the conference room. He stood in the kitchen for a while. Then he followed. They slept in the conference room, both of them. For approximately 3 hours, Imani on the couch, in the corner with her jacket over her. Dae-Hyun in a chair with his head back and his arms crossed, the light turned low. Min-jae, who had done this more times than either of them, slept in a smaller office down the hall and was awake before both of them. By 6:30 the next morning, the documentation package was complete. Min-jae presented the final version at the conference table with the particular economy of a man who has been awake all night and has converted that sleeplessness entirely into output. The counter package was 63 pages plus the audio recording. It contained the full operational chain from Han Soo-young through Yeon Ji-song through Baek Tae-won to Park's organization. It contained the fabrication analysis, the 3 technical fingerprints that proved the documents with Imani's name had been constructed and were not genuine. It contained Min-jae's own financial analysis demonstrating that the transfer records bearing her account number contained transaction patterns that were structurally impossible given the actual history of that account. It was, as a piece of work, definitive. "Will it hold in that room?" Dae-Hyun asked. "Against informed scrutiny, yes. Against people who want to believe Park's version, some of them will need more time. Min-jae looked at the stack of documents with the professional assessment of a craftsman evaluating finished work. The recording is what changes the room. People can argue with documents. The recording is a voice saying your wife's name and calling her a mechanism." He paused. "That's a different kind of evidence. It's not technical. It's human." Dae-Hyun looked at the stack. Then he said, "I'm going to sign the divorce papers before tonight." Silence in the room. Min-jae did not move. Imani, who had been reading the final documentation, went still in the specific way of someone who has heard something unexpected and is processing whether they heard it correctly. "The papers have been sitting unsigned for weeks," Dae-Hyun said. He looked at Imani, not at Min-jae, at Imani. "I kept them unsigned because I told myself there was still a conversation to be had. I told myself that not signing was holding a door open." He exhaled. "It wasn't holding a door open. It was holding you in a legal status you didn't choose and haven't consented to continue." He picked up his coffee. "That's not a door. That's a cage. And I'm not going to walk into that room tonight to defend your name while simultaneously refusing to respect your choice." She looked at him. He looked back. "I'll have them ready," he said. "Before we go tonight," she held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the documentation. "Walk me through the sequencing one more time," she said to Min-jae. "I want to know exactly when the recording gets played. The day moved with a particular compressed quality of a day running toward a fixed point." Dae-Hyun made calls. He reached 3 of the district heads before noon, men who had been in his network long enough to receive a call from him as an event that preceded something significant, and who listened without speaking as he told them, in general terms, that the assembly tonight was not what it appeared to be, and that they should reserve judgment on any documentation presented to them until the full picture had been made available. 2 of the 3 told him they understood. The third, a man named Gwang Ho, who ran the Inshin connections, and who Dae-Hyun had worked alongside for 15 years, said something slightly different. "I've already received a preliminary summary," Gwang Ho said. His voice was careful, the careful of someone triangulating in real time. From Park's office, Dae-Hyun was quiet for a moment. "What did it say?" "That there were concerns about the security of your operation. That documentation had come to light." A pause. "It mentioned your wife. Ex-wife. It mentioned her involvement in a data breach." "That's fabricated," Dae-Hyun said. "I'll demonstrate that tonight, in full. With documentation and a recording of the people who built the fabrication." Gwang Ho was quiet for 4 seconds. Dae-Hyun counted them the way he had counted Han's silence in the conference room 2 days ago. "I'll be there tonight," Gwang Ho said finally. "I'll hear it." He ended the call. Dae-Hyun told Min-jae. Min-jae noted it with the expression of a man adjusting his load-bearing wall calculation. "He's not ours tonight," Min-jae said. "Not fully. He'll listen. He won't be on your side when you walk in. How many of the 23 are like him?" Based on what Park's office was sending preliminary summaries to, I estimate 6, possibly 8. Min-jae looked at the ceiling briefly. which was the closest he came to an expression of resignation. The majority haven't received anything yet. Park's plan was to present the full package in the room, not distribute it in advance. The preliminary to Guang-ho was a trust-building gesture, bringing him in early. Smart, Dae-Hyun said, without admiration. Just acknowledgement. Yes, Min-jae said, also without admiration. At 4 in the afternoon, a courier arrived at Min-jae's office with a sealed envelope, addressed to Dae-Hyun. No return address. The seal was plain wax. Min-jae's security people scanned it before it was handed over. Inside was a single card, printed, not handwritten. 6 words. Don't come tonight. This doesn't end well. No signature. Dae-Hyun turned the card over. Blank on the back. He looked at it for a moment and then set it on the table face down and did not mention it again. At 5:30, his attorney arrived with a folder. Dae-Hyun signed the divorce papers at the conference table with Min-jae as witness, in the same room where they had been working all day, without ceremony. He signed each page where marked, initialed where required, and handed the folder back to his attorney with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided something and is executing that decision without the luxury of feeling it fully yet. His attorney left. Imani had been in the adjacent office taking a call, came back to the conference room and looked at the table where the folder had been, and then at Dae-Hyun. He met her eyes, just that. No speech. She nodded once. The nod of someone receiving information that changes the shape of the room. Then she said, "We need to leave in 90 minutes." At 6:50 they were in the car, Dae-Hyun and Min-jae in the back. Imani beside Min-jae, the documentation package in a case on the seat between them. The driver navigated the evening traffic with the efficiency of someone who had been navigating Dae-Hyun's movements for a long time. Nobody spoke much. The city moved past the windows. Imani watched it without expression. Dae-Hyun watched the road ahead. Min-jae reviewed notes. At 7:40, they arrived at the building in Gangnam-gu. The hotel lobby was lit and busy in the way of hotel lobbies on weekday evenings, people in professional dress moving through with the focused purposefulness of people who have somewhere to be. Min-jae had arranged access. 3 staff passes not forged, but acquired through a relationship with a facility manager that predated the current situation by 4 years. Dae-Hyun had used this building's private floors enough times that 2 of the elevator operators recognized him by face and looked at his staff pass without really looking at it. Private facility was on the 40th through 42nd floors. They rode up in silence. The elevator doors opened on 40. 2 men in the corridor who did not work for the hotel. They looked at Dae-Hyun, then at Min-jae, then, with a fractional additional attention, at Imani. "This floor is restricted tonight," one of them said, not aggressive. Professional. The kind of professional that signals clear instruction and no particular desire to improvise. "I'm aware," Dae-Hyun said. "Tell Park that Dae-Hyun Ryu is here. He'll want to know before I walk in, not after." The men looked at each other. The kind of look that passes between people sharing a specific uncertainty about which direction the authority in this situation actually flows. One of them stepped away and made a call. They waited in the corridor. 40 seconds. Imani stood with her hands loose at her sides and her breathing controlled in the specific way of someone actively managing adrenaline. Dae-Hyun stood with his weight even on both feet and his face showing nothing. Min-jae held the case. The man came back. "He says to come in," the man said. Something in his voice had shifted slightly. The professional neutrality had a faint additional quality. Now the quality of someone who has been told something that made the situation more interesting than anticipated. They walked down the corridor. The room at the end was large, as private club rooms go, not a ballroom, but a space that held 23 people at a long table without crowding, with additional chairs along the walls for aides and secondary staff. The lighting was warm and deliberate. The table was set with water and coffee, no food, the signal of a meeting that was expected to resolve one way or another before anyone got hungry. 23 people. They all looked up when Dae-Hyun walked in. He took in the room, in the way he took it in every room, one continuous sweep, cataloging faces, positions, expressions. The specific body language of people encountering a situation they had not been briefed on. He found Guang-ho at the middle of the table, face neutral. He found 4 faces he recognized as having received Park's preliminary summary slightly elevated alertness, the posture of people who have been told a story and are now looking at one of the characters in it. He found Park's sundial at the far end of the table. Park was 61 years old, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had survived a very long time in a world that did not extend longevity generously through a combination of intelligence and patience, and the specific ruthlessness of someone who never let what he wanted interfere with what was effective. He looked at Dae-Hyun walking through the door, and his face moved through something that lasted less than a second before settling back into the particular smooth neutrality of a man who has prepared for several versions of how an evening might go. Dae-Hyun held his gaze across the length of the room. Then Park looked at Imani. Something in Park's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. The expression of a man whose calculation has encountered an unmapped variable. Dae-Hyun pulled out the chair at the near end of the table directly opposite Park, the full length of the room between them, and sat down. Imani sat to his right. Min-jae placed the documentation case on the table. The room was very quiet now. One of the district heads, an older man named Yoon, who had been in this world since before Dae-Hyun had arrived in it, looked at Imani and then at Dae-Hyun with the kind of open expression that says, a person does not yet have enough information to arrange their face appropriately. This is a private coordination meeting, one of Park's people said from the wall. A young man, professional, the voice of someone relaying an institutional position. The invitation list was confirmed. I'm aware of the invitation list, Dae-Hyun said. He looked at the room, not at Park specifically. At the room, at the 23 faces. I'm also aware of what this meeting is actually for. What documentation is going to be presented? What story is going to be told tonight? He opened the case. Thought it would be more efficient for everyone to hear both versions before committing to one. A silence. Park spoke for the first time. His voice was measured and unremarkable, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. Dae-Hyun. This isn't a format I arranged for debate. I know. Dae-Hyun looked at him directly. You arranged it for a presentation. I'm suggesting we make it a complete one. He held Park's gaze. You have documentation. So do I. The people in this room are smart enough to evaluate both. The documentation I have speaks for itself. So does mine. Park looked at him for a moment. The room was so quiet that the ventilation system was audible. 23 people waiting to see which direction the ground went. Then Park said, then by all means, show them yours. Dae-Hyun looked at Min-jae. Min-jae began distributing the counter documentation, moving around the table with the focused efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this, placing a copy in front of each person with the same sequence and the same economy of motion. Dae-Hyun stood up. What you have in front of you is the complete operational chain of how information left my organization over the past 11 months, he said, including the name of the internal contact who was compromised, the external operative who managed the transfer, the intermediary who connected that operative to the organization that commissioned the operation. He paused. And the documentation of a secondary package, a fabricated evidence file that was designed to be presented tonight, to you, in this room, with my ex-wife's name on it as the source of the breach. He let that settle. He watched it move through the room, watched the specific way 23 people absorbed information that rearranged the event they thought they were attending. Gwang-ho, in the middle of the table, looked at the documentation in front of him and then at Dae-Hyun. His face was doing something that had not yet resolved into an expression. Page 41, Dae-Hyun said. The fabrication analysis. Technical fingerprints in the document construction. The same formatting artifact appears across 7 fabricated files and matches a template used by a specific operative in the organization that commissioned this operation. He looked at Park. Your organization, Sung-il. Park's expression did not collapse. It tightened. A fractional controlled tightening that Dae-Hyun caught because he had been looking for it. This is a counter-narrative, Park said to the room. Even. Reasonable. The voice of a man who has prepared for this version of the evening. Dae-Hyun's people are fast. I'd expect nothing less. He looked at the assembled parties. Question is, which documentation reflects what actually occurred? Play the recording, Dae-Hyun said to Min-jae. Min-jae placed a small audio device on the table and pressed play. The room was quiet enough that the recording was perfectly audible from every seat. Shin's voice smooth, professional. The voice of a man giving a briefing filled the space. The wife is the primary access mechanism. The room did not move. Ryu's organizational discipline does not extend to the personal sphere. One of the district heads shifted in his chair. The marriage is the gap. Use it. Dae-Hyun watched Park's face during the recording. He watched the tightening become something more fundamental, not collapse, not panic, but the specific expression of a man who has just seen his most carefully prepared position become untenable and is calculating the distance to the nearest viable alternative. The recording continued. Bake's intermediary naming the target, naming Imani specifically, describing the fabrication plan, describing the secondary package with her account number as the evidence of involvement that never existed. 3 minutes and 40 seconds. When it ended, the room was still. Dae-Hyun looked at the 23 faces. He found Gwang Ho. The older man was looking at the documentation in his hands. His jaws had set in the way of someone arriving at a conclusion they do not entirely welcome. He looked at Yoon, the oldest man at the table. Yoon was looking at Park. He looked at Park. Park's face had arrived at a specific quality of stillness, not defeat, not exposure. Something more dangerous than either. The expression of a man who has been playing a long game and has just watched one of its key pieces removed, and who is already running the calculation of whether the game can continue without it. There's more in the documentation, Dae-Hyun said to the room. Technical analysis, financial records, testimony from the internal contact who was compromised. All of it verifiable. All of it pointing to an operation designed not just to steal information from my organization, but to use my marriage, my ex-wife's name, her business, her reputation as the weapon. He paused. Let it sit. I want to be clear about one thing before this room makes any judgment. The operation found a real opening to exploit. I gave them that opening. He looked at the table, the room, at no one specific. What happened in my marriage was my failure. Nobody placed a weapon in my hand and forced me to fire it. I made choices that made my personal life a vulnerability. And people with resources and patience use that vulnerability. He looked up. I'm not here tonight to make myself the wronged party. I'm here because my ex-wife's name was used as a fabricated source for a breach she had nothing to do with, and I will not allow that to stand in front of this room or any room. Silence. Gwang Ho set the documentation down. He looked at Park, then at Dae-Hyun, then at Imani, the first time anyone in the room had looked directly at her since the recording had played. Ms. Badu, he said. His voice had a particular quality, not quite an apology, not quite an acknowledgement, but the careful tone of a man who is adjusting. Imani looked at him. She held his gaze with the same direct, unhurried quality she had brought to every room she had sat in this week. She said nothing. She let the fact of her presence speak for itself, a woman who had no reason to be in this room except the truth of her own situation, who had come anyway, who was sitting here not as Dae-Hyun's wife, or his ex-wife, or anyone's access mechanism, but as herself. Gwang Ho looked back at the documentation. Park stood up. The room shifted. The physical weight of it, a man of Park Sung-il's specific gravity, rising from his chair in a room full of people who understood exactly what that gravity meant. The recording is interesting, Park said. His voice was still measured, still even. The voice of a man spending enormous energy on sounding like a man who still controls the situation. Its provenance is unverified. The chain of custody between the original recording and this playback has not been established to a standard that I made the recording, Imani's voice, clear, completely steady, into the silence that followed Park's sentence. Every head in the room turned to her. Park looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has just been interrupted and is deciding whether the interruption has weight. The woman who provided the recording obtained it at her second meeting with the intermediary you're hearing on the tape, Imani said. She looked at Park without performance, without heat, without anything other than the flat direct quality of someone reporting accurate information. She came to me directly. She provided it to me in exchange for a documented protection arrangement. I vouched for that arrangement. I'm the chain of custody. She looked at the room. My name was being used as a mechanism in an operation I had no knowledge of and no involvement in. I came tonight because I have a right to be in any room where that lie is being presented as truth. She paused. And because I wanted the people in this room to see the difference between a fabricated document with my name on it and the actual woman whose name it carries. The room was very still. Park Sung-il looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression that had not been there before, not respect, exactly, but the specific recalibration of a man who has encountered something his model did not account for. Then he looked at Dae-Hyun. The two men looked at each other across the full length of the table. 23 people between them and around them. The documentation in front of every set of hands. The recording still in the air. You burned a lot to get to this room tonight, Park said. His voice had dropped slightly. Not for the benefit of the room now. For Dae-Hyun specifically. Yes, Dae-Hyun said, territory. Alliances. The credibility that comes from not airing your personal life in front of your network. Yes, for her. Park looked at Imani. For a woman who divorced you. For the truth, Dae-Hyun said. The fact that she divorced me doesn't change what's true. And it doesn't change what I owe her. He held Park's gaze. It changes nothing about what I'm willing to do to protect her name. Another silence. Longer this time. Yoon, the oldest man at the table, looked at Park with the expression of a man who has been in this world long enough to have developed strong opinions about what constitutes a foolish expenditure of energy. Sung-il, Yoon said, just the name. The way you say someone's name when what you mean is, this is the moment to read the room. Park looked at him. Then Park looked at the table. At the documentation in front of him. At the room of 23 people, most of whom were looking at him now with the specific quality of attention that indicates a rebalancing is in progress. Not a vote, not a tribunal, but the invisible, ongoing, ruthlessly practical reassessment that runs through this kind of network when a play has been exposed, and the question becomes what the cost of continuing looks like compared to the cost of stepping back. His face was doing something very controlled and very expensive. Dae-Hyun watched him. Park Sung-il was not a man who had survived this long by refusing to calculate. He was calculating right now, behind the controlled face, in the real-time way of a man who needs an answer before the room finishes. Finishing the calculation before the room finished reading him. The silence in that room had weight, physical weight, the kind you feel in your chest when 23 people are all withholding breath at the same moment, all waiting for the same thing, all watching a man decide who he is going to be in the next 30 seconds. Park Sung-il set both hands flat on the table. He looked at the documentation in front of him. Then he looked at Dae-Hyun. Then for a long and specific moment, he looked at Imani, at the woman who had come into his carefully arranged room and sat down and spoken 4 sentences that had done more damage to his position than the 63 pages of counter-documentation. He picked up the documentation, squared the pages against the table, set it back down. The secondary package, he said. His voice had changed, not dramatically, but the measured quality was carrying more effort now, the way a held note carries more effort the longer it sustains. The file with Ms. Badu's name. That was Beck's construction. I commissioned the operation. I did not commission the specific mechanism he chose to use. He looked at the room. Not a confession. Not an apology. A distinction being drawn in public, carefully, in front of witnesses, because Park Sung-il had survived this long by understanding that how you say something in a room like this is as consequential as what you say. The recording speaks to Beck's methodology. I accept that the fabricated evidence against Miss Badu was an overreach that I was not fully briefed on. The room was quiet. Dae-Hyun looked at him. He understood exactly what was happening. Park was not surrendering. He was performing a strategic retreat to a more defensible position, cutting Baek loose, accepting partial responsibility for the operation, while distancing himself from the most damaging element of it, the element that was sitting in this room in a green blouse, with her hands folded on the table. It was elegant. It was the move of a man who had been reading rooms like this one for 40 years. It was also, Dae-Hyun noted, the first time Park Sung-il had ever admitted anything in front of witnesses, which meant the recording had done exactly what Min-jae had said it would do, not destroyed Park's position. Nothing would do that in a single evening, but made the cost of maintaining the current strategy higher than the cost of recalculating. Yoon spoke from his end of the table, the territorial question. His voice was the dry, unhurried voice of a man who has watched many evenings like this one and understands that they always eventually return to the practical. Whatever the mechanism, whatever the methodology, there is still an underlying question about the Northern Network that brought us all here. The Northern Network is not in negotiation tonight, Dae-Hyun said. He looked at Yoon with the directness of someone speaking to the room through a specific person. The terms Park wanted were structured around leverage that no longer exists. The fabricated file doesn't land. The secondary narrative about my ex-wife's involvement is demonstrably false. Whatever conversation needs to happen about territorial arrangements, it happens from a baseline of accurate information, not from a position created by manufactured evidence. Yoon looked at Park. Park was quiet for a moment. The room waited. The conversation about arrangements, Park said finally, can be deferred to another time. He said it with the specific flatness of a man closing a door without slamming it. Professional's version of retreat. Tonight's agenda has evolved beyond its original scope. Gwang Ho, in the middle of the table, exhaled through his nose. It was a small sound, but in the silence of that room, it was audible to the people nearest him, and those people heard in it what it was. A man who had nearly been pulled to one side of something and had just watched the ground shift enough to make him grateful. He had held his position. He looked at Dae-Hyun. Then he looked at Imani. Miss Badu, he said. I apologize that you had to be in this room tonight. Imani looked at him steadily. I chose to be in this room, she said. That's a different thing. He nodded. Slowly. The nod of a man taking the correction. The meeting dissolved over the next 40 minutes in the way that meetings like this one dissolve when the primary agenda has been dismantled, not with ceremony, not with resolution, but with the gradual, careful departure of people who need to go somewhere private and reassess. Conversations happened in pairs and threes near the door. Documents were folded into jacket pockets. The carefully arranged water and coffee remained largely untouched. Park Sung-il left third. He did not look at Dae-Hyun on his way out. He looked at Imani once briefly, at the door, a look that carried no animosity and no apology, but something more complicated than either, the specific expression of a man recalibrating his model of a situation he thought he had fully mapped. Then he was gone. The room emptied. Dae-Hyun sat at the table long after the last person left. Min-jae was at the other end, packing the documentation case with the quiet efficiency of completion. Imani sat beside Dae-Hyun and looked at the long table with its untouched water glasses and its scattered pages, and the particular silence of a room that has just held something enormous and is now simply a room again. It's not over, she said. No, he said. Park doesn't stop because one evening went wrong. He recalibrates. He looks for a different angle. He waits longer. Dae-Hyun looked at the table. But the angle that used you is gone. He burned it tonight in front of witnesses to save the rest of his position. He can't use your name again without those same witnesses, remembering what he just said about Baek's methodology. She was quiet for a moment. You gave up a lot tonight. The territory conversation will happen eventually, on different terms than he wanted. But it'll happen. I'm not talking about territory. He looked at her. You stood up in front of your entire network, she said, and told them your marriage failed because of your choices. That's not nothing. In this world. It's also true, he said. That's the only reason it was worth saying. She looked at him, at his profile, at the particular set of his jaw that she had learned over 11 years to read the way you read, whether the difference between a front that passes and one that settles. He was tired. She could see it now, in the way she could always see it, underneath the controlled surface. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been running on something harder than sleep for several days. Come on, she said. She stood up. He looked at her. It's late, she said. Min-jae can deal with the debrief. She picked up her bag. I'm getting food. I haven't eaten since this morning. And I can't think straight when I haven't eaten. You probably can't either. He looked at her for a moment. At the offer inside what was not quite an invitation, he stood up. They found a restaurant 3 blocks away, not one of his, not somewhere anyone knew either of them, just a late-night Korean barbecue place, with plastic top tables and the particular warmth of a kitchen working at full capacity. They sat in a corner booth. A young server brought metal cups of cold water and a laminated menu, and looked at them with the complete indifference of someone who was 20 years old and had 6 more tables to cover. They ordered without looking at each other much. When the food came the banchan in their small white dishes, the grill heating. In the center of the table, Imani picked up her chopsticks and ate with the focused attention of someone who was, as she had said, genuinely hungry. Dae-Hyun watched her for a moment and then did the same. They ate for a while without talking. It was not comfortable silence. It was not uncomfortable either. It was the silence of two people on the other side of something enormous, in a booth with hot charcoal between them, too tired for performance and too aware of each other for pretense. Yeonji, Imani said eventually, the protection arrangement I promised her. My attorney will coordinate with yours, he said. Whatever documentation she needs. She gave us the recording. She deserves the exit. She does, he said. No qualifier. She turned a piece of pork belly on the grill. Watched the fat render. Han Soo-Young. He'll be held until we're certain we have everything useful from him. Then he paused. That situation resolves itself. She looked at him across the grill, the heat between them and the noise of the restaurant around them. Does it resolve itself cleanly? He held her gaze. He won't be hurt, he said. He gave us what we needed. That has a value. A beat. He also can't go back to the position he had. That's the cost of what he did. She accepted that. It was, she understood, the most honest version of how this world operated, not clean, not just in the classical sense, but with its own particular accounting. Costs and values and a ledger that ran on its own terms. She turned to the meat again. The divorce papers, she said. She said it quietly, not looking at him. He was quiet. Today, before the meeting, she looked at the grill. Why today specifically? He thought about how to say this. He thought about the formulations that were available to him, the explanations that were true but not complete, the ones that were complete but too much for a plastic-top table in a restaurant where neither of them was known. He thought about the fact that he had spent 11 years being a man who chose the formulations over the complete thing, and that choosing the formulation was part of how they had arrived in this restaurant on the other side of their marriage. "'Cause I was about to walk into a room to defend you," he said. "And the only way to do that with any integrity was to not be holding you there at the same time." He looked at the table. Keeping those papers unsigned was, I told myself, it was leaving a door open. But I was keeping a legal claim on you, while telling myself I respected your choice. He exhaled slowly. Those two things don't fit in the same man. I had to pick one. She was quiet for a moment. "You picked the one that didn't benefit you," she said. "Picked the one that was true." She looked up at him. Particular quality of his face in the warm light of the restaurant, the lines of it, the familiar geography she had spent 11 years learning. It looked different now. Not changed. The same. But she was looking at it from a different place than she had ever looked at it from before. And the difference was not in him. "I know," she said softly. They sat with that. The food continued. The restaurant moved around them. A table nearby erupted in brief laughter over something. The server came and went. The city outside the windows ran its indifferent, continuous course through the late hour. At some point she couldn't have said exactly, when the weight of the evening settled into something that was not yet peace, but was the shape that peace would eventually grow in. The specific exhaustion of people who have been through something real and are still breathing. She set her chopsticks down. "I need to sleep," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. At the man across the table who had signed those papers this afternoon and had stood in a room full of dangerous people tonight and had said, in front of witnesses, that he had been the mechanism of his own undoing, who had said her name with a particular weight of something he would not bargain away. "Thank you," she said. "For tonight. For what you said in that room. You did the work," he said. "The recording. The documentation. You did most of it." "We did most of it." She corrected him without drama. "That's a fact." He looked at her. She picked up her bag. She left cash on the table, her half. Exactly. And she had calculated it in her head before she put it down. He noticed. He said nothing. They walked out of the restaurant together and stood on the pavement in the night air. Her car was one direction. His was another. She looked at him. Dae-Hyun. She said his name the way she had always said it, not shortened, not modified, the full 2 syllables. The particular way she had always said it, that he had never asked her about, and that he had heard in his own head, in the quiet rooms of the penthouse every night for the past several weeks. "Imani, I'm going to need some time," she said. "Not forever. Not the same as never. But time." She held his gaze. "What you did tonight, it means something. I want to be honest about that. It means something, and I need to sit with it in a space where I'm not also managing everything else that's happened. He nodded. I know, don't send things, she said. Don't call unless it's about the legal details. Don't do the thing you do, where you manage the situation from the outside. She looked at him steadily. Just let it be what it is, and let me decide what I do with it, from a place that belongs to me. Okay, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she walked to her car. He watched her go. He stood on the pavement and watched the car pull away, and he did not move until the taillights disappeared at the corner. And then he stood there a little longer, in the night air, with the city moving around him. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel relieved. He felt the specific weight of a man who has done the right thing and discovered that the right thing does not resolve the way you hope it will, that it does not return the thing you lost, that it does not collapse the distance you created, that it is simply the right thing, and it has to be enough on its own terms. He walked to his car. In the months that followed, things changed in the way that things change after a real event, not cleanly, not all at once, but in the accumulating way of small adjustments made by people who have been altered by what they survived. Park Sung-sil withdrew from the Northern Network territorial conversation for 14 months. When the conversation eventually happened, it happened on different terms, a negotiation between parties with more accurate information about each other, conducted without fabricated leverage. Dae-Hyun conceded one of the 3 districts, not under duress, but through a calculation that the concession was sustainable and the relationship with the remaining structures was worth preserving. It was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was the resolution available in the real world, which is rarely either. Baektae-won was the cost that Park Sung-sil for the evening in Gangnam-gu, not through any action of Dae-Hyun's, through the internal accounting of Park's own organization, which determined that a senior operative who had chosen his own methodology over his employer's explicit parameters was a liability they could not sustain. Dae-Hyun's heard about it 6 weeks later and acknowledged it with the specific absence of satisfaction that comes from understanding that someone else's fall does not constitute your own standing. Hans Soo-young was released from the secure location after 11 weeks. He left Seoul. Dae-Hyun did not track where he went. He had given a complete account and had been a reasonably young man who had made a devastating miscalculation, and Dae-Hyun found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not have the appetite for extended punishment that he might have had a year earlier. He noted that development internally turned it over, decided it was not weakness but something more like accuracy, a better calibration of what actually served him, versus what had previously felt like serving him. Yeon Ji-song relocated to a city outside Korea with the documentation Imani's attorney had prepared. She sent one message through the attorney, not to Dae-Hyun, to Imani. 3 sentences. Imani read them, sat with them for a while, and filed them in a particular interior drawer that she maintained for things she needed to keep, but didn't need to act on. Min-jae received a bonus that he had not been promised and had not asked for, and which he accepted with the complete absence of expression that characterized his relationship with most things, and which Dae-Hyun had long understood as a form of deep and undemonstrative loyalty. Dae-Hyun began dismantling the most violent elements of his operation, not all at once, not as a performance of change, quietly, methodically, over a period of many months, restructuring the components that relied on the kind of force he was less willing to authorize, redirecting capital into the legitimate businesses that had always been there as a layer, but were now becoming something more primary. It was expensive. It was complicated. Several people who had been useful to him became less useful and told him so, and he accepted that with the equanimity of someone who has updated what he considers useful. He did not call Imani. He did not send things. He honored what she had asked for, in the way that honoring something costs the most not once, not in a single dramatic gesture, but every day, in the repeated choosing to not reach for the familiar thing, to not manage from the outside, to let the space she had asked for remain space. He was not unchanged by it. Nobody goes through the particular discipline of not reaching for what they want most, day after day, without being changed. The change was not comfortable. He was not sure it was meant to be. Imani's catering company secured the lease for the kitchen expansion space, a different location than the original one, better in two specific ways and worse in one, and hers in the uncomplicated sense of being entirely her own. The contract with the financial firm held, and she delivered 3 events in the first 6 months that generated referrals, and by the end of the year, the company had grown to a size that required 2 additional full-time staff and a larger vehicle for delivery logistics. She hired Cora's younger cousin, who turned out to be extraordinary with pastry, and she promoted Theo and gave him an actual title, and she negotiated the expansion lease herself, starting from the original position, without anyone's interference. She was, by any reasonable measure, doing well. She was also, by any honest measure, still carrying something that doing well did not resolve the particular weight of an 11-year love that had been genuine and had been broken and had turned out to have been the target of people who understood its value better than her husband had. That weight did not disappear with competence or independence or the satisfying mathematics of a successful business quarter. It sat in its particular corner, and she acknowledged it on the days when it was loud and moved through it on the days when it was quiet, and she did not perform its absence. A daise called every Sunday. Sometimes they talked about the business, sometimes about nothing specific, sometimes about their mother who lived in Lagos and video called on a separate schedule with the specific energy of a woman who had opinions about everything and was not managing them. Imani talked to her mother about the divorce with the directness she had inherited from her and was grateful for, and her mother was silent for a long moment, and then said something in Igbo that translated loosely as, "A tree that survives the storm does not spend time describing the storm to other trees." She paused and then added, in English, "Although you can describe it to me in as much detail as you want, I have time." Imani had laughed for the first time in a long time. Actually laughed with the full unself-conscious quality of someone who is not monitoring the laugh. She had sat in her car outside her kitchen and laughed until she was briefly also crying, and then sat in the parking lot for a few minutes in the dark and thought about the specific resilience of people who raised you and felt not healed, not resolved, but less alone in the specific and important way that comes from being known by someone who knew you before you knew yourself. 8 months after the evening in the restaurant on a Thursday morning in early spring, she went back to the penthouse. She did not call ahead, plan it specifically, or she did not plan it consciously, which is not exactly the same thing. She was driving past the building on her way to a supplier meeting, and she made the turn, and then she was in the parking structure, and then she was in the elevator, and then she was standing in the foyer of the 42nd floor with her key that she had not returned and that he had not asked for. The penthouse smelled like gardenias. She stood in the foyer and breathed that in and felt the particular complicated quality of something that has been both wound and comfort for a very long time, so long that you can no longer fully separate the two. She heard him before she saw him. He was in the kitchen, the same marble counter, the same morning light, and he was on a call, talking in the low, clipped way he talked when the conversation was about something with operational weight. She heard his voice and stood in the foyer and let it move through her, the way you let something move through you when you are no longer afraid of what it will do. Came around the corner with his phone still in his hand and stopped. He saw her. She watched his face, the same geography, the same process of receiving something that required management before it was expressed. But then, beneath the management, and faster than it used to be, as though the layer had thinned, she saw the actual thing. The thing underneath the architecture. The specific and unguarded way his eyes changed when he looked at her. He ended the call without looking away from her. Just pressed the button and put the phone in his pocket. "Imani," he said. She had thought on the drive over that she did not consciously plan about what she might say. About all the things that were still true, and all the things that were different now, and the specific distance between where they were and where they had been, and whether that distance could be mapped and traveled, or whether it simply existed as the permanent record of what had happened. She had thought about 8 months, about the things she had watched him not do, in ways she was not supposed to know about, but inevitably had, because the absence of interference is its own information when you have spent 11 years learning the shape of someone's patterns. He had not called. He had not sent things. He had not managed from the outside. He had simply done what she asked, day after day, with no visible reward and no guarantee of outcome. She had thought about the moment in the clubroom when he had stood up in front of 23 people and said, without performance, that he had been the mechanism of his own undoing, that his failure of the marriage was his failure, not a product of Yeonji's manipulation, not a casualty of Park's operation. She had thought about the divorce papers on the table in Min Jae's conference room, signed before the meeting, offered without being asked for, with no negotiation and no conditions. She thought about all of it and stood in the foyer with the gardenia scent around her and looked at the man in the kitchen doorway, Lay, who was looking at her with the particular quality of someone who has been practicing, not reaching, and is currently working very hard at continuing that practice when everything in him wants to stop. She reached into her bag. She took out a copy of the divorce papers, the finalized, legally complete copy signed by both parties, processed, recorded, the legal reality of what they were now fully established and documented. She walked across the foyer and into the kitchen and set the papers on the counter between them. He looked at them, then at her. "I forgave you a long time ago," she said. Her voice was steady. Not performed steady, actually steady. The steadiness of someone who has arrived at a sentence after months of working toward it. Forgiveness wasn't the hard part. She looked at him. Trust took longer. He did not speak. He was looking at her with the expression she had found underneath the architecture, the unguarded version, and he was not trying to cover it. "I'm not here to restore what we had," she said. "That's gone. I know what it was, and I know what broke it, and I know that some things don't restore. They only build forward, or they don't." She held his gaze. "I'm here because I want to know if there's a forward, not the old thing. Something new, between the people we are now, which are different people than we were." She paused. "Are we different people?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I am," he said. His voice was rough in the way of something that has been unused and is now being called on. "Can't speak for you. I know you can't." She looked at the papers on the counter between them. "I can speak for myself. I'm not the same woman who stood in that doorway a year ago. I'm not the same woman who left." She looked up. "I'm someone who built something that belongs entirely to herself, who went through something very ugly, and came out the other side still standing. Who knows now, in a way she didn't before, exactly what she's worth, and exactly what she'll accept, and exactly what she won't." She looked at him. "That woman is standing in your kitchen, asking you if there's a forward." He looked at her. At the woman who had made the call to Yeonji, with her jaw set, and her voice even. Who had walked into the room in Gangnam-gu, and sat down and spoken 4 sentences that changed the weight of an evening. Who had put cash on a restaurant table, the exact amount of her half, and said "we" when he said "you." Who had asked him for time, and meant it, and taken it and used it, and had now, 8 months later, come back. He looked at the divorce papers on the counter. He said, "Can we start again?" She did not answer immediately. She stood with the question and looked at him, and let herself feel the full complicated weight of what she was being asked, and what it would cost, and what it might build, and what it could never be, and what it might become. Then she reached across the counter. She did not take his hand dramatically. She did not close the distance between them in a rush. She reached across the counter, where the papers lay between them, and placed her hand on top of his and let it rest there. His hand turned under hers. Slowly, the way something moves when it is being careful of itself. His fingers folded around hers. They stood on opposite sides of the counter, with their hands joined on top of the paper record of everything they had been to each other, and everything they had cost each other. Penthouse was quiet around them. The city ran its continuous course outside the windows. The gardenia diffusers did their small, persistent work. Neither of them moved for a while. They did not need to. This particular moment, the two of them standing in the kitchen, with their hands joined and their eyes open, was not a beginning in the sense of something new and unmarked. It was a beginning in the harder sense. The beginning that happens after you have seen the worst of something, and the worst of someone, and the worst of yourself. And you choose, with full knowledge and no illusions, to take one step forward anyway. Not because it was simple, not because it was clean, because it was true. And in the end, after everything that had burned, and everything that had been built, and everything that had been lost, and everything that had been slowly and at great cost, rebuilt, the truth was the only thing either of them had ever really had to offer each other. It turned out to be enough, not easily, not without the ongoing work of two people who had learned the shape of their own failures and were choosing every day to build something better than what those failures had made. But enough. It was both of them understood more than enough.